miles per hour. It's almost
Blair Station on the West Coast, speaking to the troops out there and congratulating them on the war on terror and thanking them for the sacrifice. Every indication federal sources say is that this is not an act of terrorism. I'm hearing that again. So if this sounds a little bit repetitious, it's because we're getting it from different sources. The Department of Transportation now, a ground stop is in effect at all three area airports. And I have Jim Rosenfield standing by still at LaGuardia Airport. Jim, I presume there's nothing going on, no landings, no takeoffs at LaGuardia, right?
That seems to be the case, Chuck. I've had passengers I've seen walk up to Transportation Security Administration officials. They've asked, is my flight going to take off? And those TSA workers are telling would-be passengers, if you will, you're not going anywhere for right now. I am now in
the lower baggage claim level. At Terminal C in LaGuardia, it's dark. The only lights
coming in from the doorways to the outside, and the ground crews have been trucking the baggage over here. But as you can imagine, the carousels don't work, so they're just offloading the baggage from various flights for people to pick through in fairly dark conditions, find their bags, and it's been orderly. Not a lot of panic. Actually, no panic, I would say, Chuck. People are just doing what they need to do as they get outside and try to make their way wherever they're going. And as I understand from Jonathan Dienst, anybody trying to get into Manhattan, it's going to be a nightmare.
Well, I think so. Jim, you've just opened up another area of concern, and that is that because power is out in parts of the airport, obviously the screening machines, the X-ray machines, all of those machines designed to ensure airport security aren't functioning. So obviously the Transportation Security Administration is going to have its hands full right now making certain that that nobody slips through the net when they have no power.
Right, and I think they've got all hands on deck here, Chuck. I heard one of the workers, the TSA workers, telling a co-worker, no one's going anywhere, everybody stays put, and I believe they were speaking of their fellow co-workers, that everybody needs to stay here and try and deal with the situation. I'm going to make a trip back upstairs and see what I can see in the ticket counter area, but as far as I can tell, Chuck, nothing's going in or out from LaGuardia, and as I told you earlier, the captain on our flight, which came in from O'Hare, just as this was breaking, and his first indication was a handwritten sign held up by the ground crew, no power, but he was in contact with United officials in Chicago who told him that this was, as you just reported, impacting all three of our major airports.
All right. Jim, I'm sorry. Somebody was talking to me. I didn't catch the tail end of what you just said there, but I am told that we have C. Virginia Fields, Manhattan Borough President, on the telephone. Ms. Fields, you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, where are you?
I'm at 135th Street now.
What's the situation where you are?
Well, people are now beginning to mill out into the street trying to find out what is going on, but most of the people here are trying to find out ways to get home because many of the people coming from the hospitals who work don't have the subways now, so they're beginning to walk towards 149th Street to go across the bridge while it's still daylight. And we're encouraging as many people who can reach their homes by walking to start out now and do so while there's still daylight. Because obviously if the lights are not, the power is not.
Bringing power to the east from the Niagara Falls Power Hydroelectric project there. Ontario power appears to be out from Ottawa here in the east, which is on the Ontario-Quebec border, all the way to Windsor on the border with Michigan. All been treated fairly casually so far in Ottawa. There's 4 or 5 hours left of sunlight, but people are still getting out of work at the moment. And the local radio stations are all on full time with what is clearly happening to traffic in many places. But Ottawa, parts of Toronto, Windsor, Ontario, but in Quebec, just across the river from Ottawa, there is complete power, it coming, I think, from the Quebec grid up around Hudson's Bay rather than from the Niagara Peninsula.
Yeah, all of that is consistent, Peter, with what we've been hearing. Windsor, of course, just across the river from Detroit, and the power is out in Detroit and in Cleveland. What are you seeing? I mean, Dan Harris was just talking about the relatively casual and phlegmatic way that New Yorkers are taking what is happening so far. How about up there? Where are you exactly?
I'm actually on a farm just outside Ottawa, so I'm seeing very little.
I guess it's kind of quiet out there, yeah.
It's very quiet in terms of the power itself, but it is very interesting how casual the radio commentary has been on both the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and on the local private station here. people have been concerned about getting home, worried about traffic. The cops have asked people to take public transportation rather than their own cars. But about every second caller to the radio station worries about the beer or the steaks in their fridge. The financial markets have all closed here as well, so there was no disruption there. But as your previous interview said, everything runs on electricity up here, so undoubtedly there are people trapped in elevators, or the local radio station hasn't mentioned it as yet.
Yeah, I was about to say, on the good news side of the ledger, people seem to be responding very calmly. This does not appear to be the result of any terrorist activity. On the negative side of the ledger, we are only just beginning, indeed have barely begun, to get reports from some of those people who may be trapped in elevators, who may be trapped in subway trains that are caught between two stations. And of course, once dark falls, one of the things that almost inevitably happens, and we can only hope and pray that it does not happen this time, is that people take advantage of the darkness then for looting. So the tough times, the tough hours are still lying ahead of us, but at the moment, and I've been looking at pictures here of downtown Manhattan, and it is absolutely jammed with people on the streets, even though there is still some traffic trying to make its way through the city of New York, but that is being replicated all over the Northeast. Once again, New York, Detroit, Cleveland, Syracuse, Hartford, Connecticut, Toronto, Canada, and Ottawa. It may be some time before power is restored. Peter, anything else you want to add before we let you go back to vacation?
By the looks of what we're seeing in downtown Ottawa, you have a vastly greater challenge in New York. So I'll leave you with that.
All right, Peter, thank you very much indeed. I understand we've got Karen Chase over at Lincoln Center. Karen, what can you add to the sum of our knowledge?
Well, Ted, I understand you've been concerned about people stuck in the subways, and I am just outside the Lincoln Center subway where people were just pouring out from the staircase. With a combination of fear and relief etched on their faces, many of them told of the harrowing moments when the subway cars went silent, dark, and motionless, and they waited for transit officials to rescue them, and how they were guided across some tracks and to relative safety. And keep in mind,
I'm
it's
sorry.
very, very hot
Let me just
there,
ask
as you know.
hold on 1 second. I've got someone who's been babbling away in my ear here, so I haven't been able to hear what you've been telling me, Karen, and I really do want to know what is going on in the subways. What are people telling you as they come up from the subways?
Well, they talk about how the harrowing moments when the subway cars went silent, dark, and motionless, and they waited for transit officials with flashlights to rescue them, and how they were guided across the tracks and their long, dark walk to safety. Again, they emerged from the subway with a combination of fear and relief on their faces. Many of them were soaked in sweat because, as you know, it's probably about 10 to 20 degrees warmer down there than it is on the street, and it's a very hot day here in New York. I should also mention that the streets here are packed with people, many with cell phones, many with concerned looks on their faces because cell phone service is spotty at best. And cars are moving in fits and starts because, of course, the traffic lights are not working. Choppers are hovering above. Police and fire vehicles are intermittently screaming down the streets, but there is not a sense of panic. There is a sense of orderly wanting to go home, for lack of a better term, although I did see people rushing into a local fire station asking for help for 3 people who had been trapped in some elevators.
But I think we can infer from what you've been telling us, Karen, that there are somewhere beneath the streets of New York many thousands of people who are probably have been trapped in trains down there. I gather from what you're telling me that transit authority police are essentially going train to train and escorting people down. It's going to depend how far they have to walk. That will depend purely on where the train was when the electricity went out. But you fill in whatever you can on that.
Well, that's true, and I would try to get down to the subway to see what was going on. There's a subway alarm bell that's been ringing relentlessly ever since the power went out. They're not letting people down there because mostly transit officials are trying to get down there to rescue anyone who might be trapped. I should also mention that many of the subway stations are very close together, and so that is to the benefit of people that are stuck there. If they do have to be rescued, they probably don't have a horribly long walk. So that's good, and I do see transit officials going down there, making an effort to orderly rescue people.
All right. Well, do what you can, Karen, to talk to those folks, and in particular, I guess the greatest concern is going to be old people or people who have breathing problems or heart conditions, those kinds of people stuck down there. They're going to have to get them out as best they can, and maybe you can find out how they go about doing that. If there are people who are unable to walk along the tracks for a quarter mile or however far they may have to walk, what do they do with them? How do they get them out? But as soon as you can, get back to us if you will.
Will do.
Okay?
Will do.
All right. Thanks very much. We have, forgive me, Professor Morgan, we have a Professor Grange Morgan on the phone. Would you be good enough to tell me, because I didn't have a chance to jot it down as someone was talking in my ear before, tell me what your area of expertise is, and then give us whatever information you can.
I'm Granger Morgan, and I'm co-director of something called the Electricity Industry Center at Carnegie Mellon University. I obviously don't know more than you do about what has specifically happened, but it's the nature of power systems that when you load them very heavily and then you have a fault or two, as it sounds like you had at least one fault in New York this afternoon, these things can propagate through the system and overload other components, so you get propagating blackouts. And the problem has been exacerbated, made worse in the last few years because we haven't been seeing investments in upgrading the transmission system, and so each year we've run a little closer to the edge, and it sounds like finally that lack of attention in upgrading the system has caught up with us.
If something relatively small, and of course we've heard a couple of reports, and if you've been listening for the last 20 minutes or so, you will have heard me say that there was some kind of a fire at the Con Edison plant, at one of the Con Edison plants in New York. Peter Jennings was telling me a few minutes ago that apparently there was some kind of a problem at a plant in Ontario, Canada. Why would a relatively small problem at one of those plants have such a massive effect throughout the rest of the Northeast?
Well, obviously it's not supposed to, but if the system is running right near the edge and you cause a problem, then you can get waves of disruption that's spread out through the system, and that can push other bits of the system over the edge. They can have difficulties, and then those difficulties in turn can propagate and cause other problems as well. So from what I've heard, I can't say for sure that it's one fault that has caused all of this. Indeed, probably no one will know for sure for a while. But the lesson we ought to be drawing from it is that we've been pushing the system too hard in recent years. We've had close calls in places like Chicago in the past, and the basic difficulty is that the system simply doesn't have the capacity right now to meet heavy summer loads. There's one other lesson maybe we ought to draw from it. I heard you talking with folks about traffic lights being out and traffic stalled in the city. There are modern cheap technologies that could fix that problem. I mean, there's no reason when the power goes out at my house, the laptops and the clocks keep going because they have batteries in them. There are technologies that could do the same thing for traffic lights these days, and so maybe out of all of the chaos we'll learn a few lessons so that the next time we lose lights, if perhaps even in a less benign situation, say in a terror event, we'll at least have streetlights running so that emergency vehicles can get through.
All right, Professor Morgan, I've got a couple of other questions I'd like to ask you, and I promise I won't keep you hanging on too long, but my colleague Dan Harris is back, and I want to find out what he has discovered over the past 10 minutes or so. So can you stick with us for a couple of minutes?
Sure, no problem.
Thanks very much. Dan, can you hear me all right?
I can, Ted. Hello.
Where are you now?
We are now on 1st Avenue and 65th, really just inching our way downtown as we try to get to City Hall. We're trying to make it over to the highway on the east side. Unable thus far to get close to a subway station to get the flavor of what's going on down there, although Karen James gave you a little bit of it. We are, as I mentioned before, monitoring radio traffic from, among other people, the police department. And as you mentioned before, there is a real serious law enforcement risk and concern here about lawlessness in the absence of power. Though we are not hearing any reports at this point of crime, we have heard some unconfirmed, and I stress unconfirmed, reports of serious car accidents outside of city limits because of the lack of traffic lights. But right now, the main job for the police department is evacuating people from these subway stations where, as you mentioned, the power has gone down, the trains have stopped, and the lights are out. there are potentially hundreds of thousands of people stuck down there because this is rush hour. The police department also has a problem with their phone lines. Last we heard, their landlines were not working. The only way they can communicate with each other is by radio. And they're also dealing with the same traffic problems that we're dealing with. So if they do have to respond quickly somewhere, they're stuck trying to get through this traffic, which, as I can attest, is no easy task.
Well, I was going to say, Dan, I mean, I think one of the points we need to make, which is sort of self-evident, but at a time like this, I just need to sort of focus a little bit of attention on it, is that a place like downtown Manhattan has hundreds of thousands of people who come there to work. And most of those people do not come by their own transportation. They don't come by car. They'll come by subway. They'll come by train. And the question now is, how are those people going to get home? Have you had any chance to talk to anyone about that?
We haven't, not as of yet. We're trying to keep moving. But, I heard Mayor Bloomberg on the radio telling New Yorkers that his advice is to go straight home. And the first question that popped into my mind was, how? It's one thing if you can walk home from your office, but as you say, many people here rely on public transportation. I can tell you the buses are running, but not very quickly. And, of course, the subways are not. So this is going to be a major logistical problem. But
all right,
you raise a good question, and we'll start asking people on the street.
All right, Dan, thanks very much. Let me interrupt you because we have someone who we may hope actually has some solid information. Tony Early is the Chief Executive Officer of Detroit Energy. Mr. Early, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can, Ted.
Do you know what's happening? Do you know why it's happening?
I can tell you what we saw. We saw outages start to occur about an hour ago. It came from the east. We're located in the eastern third of the state of Michigan. The outages appeared to come across Ontario. We're interconnected with Ontario. We serve 2.1 million customers. Currently, our whole system is down right now. Although we do have some of our power plants still running, and we're working through our procedures to restart the system, but that's a process that takes hours. It's not a process you can run through very quickly.
If we could analogize this to some kind of a railway system, what you do if there's an accident on one part of the truck is you sort of shunt the engines around to another part of the track system. Is there any way that you can do that with energy? In other words, if the energy grid is shut down, is there any way of sort of isolating the damaged part and shunting it over to a part that is still undamaged?
Absolutely. And in fact, every utility in what is called the Eastern Interconnection, because the eastern part of the U.S. is all interconnected together. And right now, across the eastern part of the United States, there are utilities working through that process of isolating where there's damage and then starting to bring power back to those areas that are undamaged.
All right. So how long does it take before that kind of a shunt can take place and before we start seeing the power back online again?
Well, it can take from a couple of hours to several hours. I guess the best way to analogize to it was the Northeast blackout of 1965. And there, within a few hours, you started to see some areas come back, and I think it lasted as long as probably 12 hours or more before all the power came back. So it gets brought back in steps, because what you don't want to do is overload the system and cause then outages to occur again. So it'll be a very deliberate process.
This is probably something more for the municipal officials of a city like Detroit or New York or Cleveland, but how do they take care of people who are patients at home who have, let's say, oxygen that they're using that is operating on electricity and who don't have a backup power system of their own? Is there something, in other words, that immediately goes into effect, emergency procedures that can actually get to that level of specificity around a city?
Well, there are, because in the normal course of business, power outages that are caused by thunderstorms and lightning, you run into the same situation, only now it is more widespread. And so municipalities do have procedures in place. The challenge will be it will probably stress resources because weather-related outages tend to be parts of systems, and they can focus their resources here. It covers the whole system. But I think what the municipalities will be doing is following the existing procedures that they've got.
Give us a sense. I'm sitting down here in Washington, D.C. Our power has not been affected. Philadelphia has not been affected. Is there any way that what is happening in one grid can ultimately bleed over into another?
Well, that would have happened already. In fact, that's exactly what happened because these power outages seem to migrate across the east. Now, the grid is designed to take a certain level of failure, and I think one of the things that will have to be investigated is why it wasn't more geographically isolated. This seems to be a larger geographic area than you might expect. But now that the systems are stabilized, the trick will be making sure that as we bring power back, we don't exacerbate the problem.
Can you just quickly, and then I'll let you know, because I'll let you go, because obviously you have more important things to do than talking to me tonight, but just give us a sense of what the outer perimeters of this grid are, north to south, east to west.
Excuse me? I didn't catch the question.
Give me a sense of what the outer perimeter of this power grid, the one that's been affected by this, in other words, what kind of an area are we talking about, north to south, east to west?
That I can't tell you. We really can only tell you the power systems adjacent to us. We do know that Ontario is out. We do know that Ohio is mixed. There's some outages there. Parts of Ohio do have power. We also know that the western part of the state of Michigan does have power. Those are the systems that I can talk about.
Yeah, actually, even as you and I are talking, my colleagues in the control room have put up a map, and we see Ottawa to the northeast, Lansing, Michigan, and Detroit to the west, Cleveland, New York City. So it's a fairly large area, and obviously covers an enormous number of people who are affected by this. But I thank you very much, Mr. Early, for joining us. It was very good of you to take the time. And let me just go over to my ABC News colleague, Jeff Morrell. Jeff, you can give us a little bit of information on what the Federal Aviation Authority has done, because obviously planes in the air, planes that want to take off, what's happening?
Well, Ted, our producers have been on the phone with a number of federal agencies. As you mentioned, first off, the FAA tells us that there are ground stops in effect in Cleveland, all three of the New York airports, Ottawa, and Toronto. What they mean by a ground stop is basically this. If your plane is on the ground and you are scheduled to take off soon, you will not be doing so. You're going to stay on the ground indefinitely. If you are in the air, that is, and need to land at one of those airports, you will be permitted to land. But takeoffs are grounded at this point. We've also heard, Ted, from a couple of other federal agencies which are working on this problem. The Department of Energy was a little bit reluctant to talk to us. They say at this point, which echoes what we've heard from other agencies, that nothing so far indicates terrorism was the cause of this outage. They say they have a team on it right now, are trying to discern the cause. The Department of Homeland Security is also working on this. They say they are in contact with state and local authorities as well as energy companies. And what is interesting here is they say that they are sending out a signal to the network to determine where the disruption occurred, and then they're going to deploy people to the site. They caution that could take some time, and they advise that people pay heed to the advice of local officials. They also say that FEMA is attempting to determine if it is necessary to deploy federal emergency resources to any of the affected sites. So that's what we have at this point from the federal agencies. It sounds as though a lot of people are working on this, and not a lot of people have much to tell us at this point. In fact, I should point out that Homeland Security was very interested in what we knew about this problem. So I think everybody at this point is grappling to find out what exactly is going on here.
Somewhat less than encouraging to hear that, but just tell me, Jeff, who is trying to pinpoint where the problem is? Which agency?
I don't know particularly which agency. The information we have is from the Homeland Security Department is that a signal is being sent out, presumably along the power grid, and they are trying to determine where the disruption occurred. It's unclear if the Department of Homeland Security is the one who is doing this, or if the Department of Energy or any other federal agencies are doing that. I am unsure at this point, Ted. I forget when they reorganized the government and created this huge entity, Department of Homeland Security, if DOE, the Department of Energy, now falls under Homeland Security. I'm unclear on that at this point.
Yeah, I am too, but we have Professors Gross and Morgan still on the line, both of them experts in this area, so Well, Professor Gross is gone. Professor Morgan, you're still with us. Can you answer that question? When you talk about sending a signal to pinpoint where the problem is, I would imagine it has to be the power company that does that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the power company can. Actually, there are regional control centers, and it's not so much that you send a signal over the power lines. There are all across the grid, there are sensors that tell you the status of the system, and you can be sure there are folks in regional control rooms right now trying to isolate this problem and prevent it from spreading further. You were asking about about power grids in the U.S. There are basically 3 grids. The whole western part of the U.S. is one. Texas is a separate grid. And then all of the eastern United States and Canada, eastern Canada, is a separate grid. The collapse that we've had is going on within the eastern grid, but it's interconnected, and the fact that it hasn't spread further means that people in control rooms all across the Northeast have managed to prevent the propagating or the cascading failures from affecting other parts of the grid, at least so far.
What is it that we can expect to see happening over the next couple of hours? In other words, what is the likely impact going to be? People, as some of my colleagues have been reporting, are handling this in a very sort of level and even-handed manner at the moment. The good news, again, and let me just keep repeating this, is no evidence that this had anything to do with a terrorist attack. I know that was probably one of the first or second thoughts that went through everybody's mind, but we've got to deal with the problems that are going to be confronting each of these cities as darkness falls. What's on your mind?
Well, I mean, obviously, one of the priorities is to get the power back on, and as a power official explained to you a few minutes ago, you can't, because these things are dynamic systems, that is, they're not just like drive shafts, they're more like sending power through springs, and you have to bring the things up very carefully. So what people are now doing are isolating parts of the system, trying to make sure that everything is working, and then bring them slowly back up. Because when you turn a power plant on, you can't just connect it, you have to get it properly phased with the alternating current in the rest of the system, and that takes time. And so you can be sure that all across the Northeast right now, power company officials are working to gradually try to restore service, but it could take many hours given the scale of the disruption.
I have just one other question at the moment, and that is, who's in charge? Who's running the show? Who reports to whom?
There are regional control centers that have been set up after the Northeast blackout of 1965. The country organized itself in terms of a series of regional centers, and those folks would be calling the shots. They can tell individual power companies what to turn on and turn off in order to try to restore the system to stability.
But I mean, how does New York coordinate with Detroit, Michigan? How does Detroit coordinate with Cleveland or with Toronto?
Well, these
who takes precedence here?
These control centers have established protocols for how they're going to communicate with each other and how they will gradually restore service. The problem at the moment, of course, is to make sure that the problem doesn't propagate any further, and then gradually isolate and bring pieces of the system back up.
All right. Well, listen, Professor Morgan, you've been a huge help, and thank you. Is there some aspect of this, because I may not know enough to ask the right questions, is there some aspect of this that you feel we should know about that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, well, let me just say one thing, and that is, we've been lucky over the last few years. We've come close to having an event like this for several years now. And the reason is that as a result of restructuring of the power system, people have been reluctant to make investments in upgrading the grid because it hasn't been clear who was going to end up owning various pieces of the grid. Hopefully, this will now help push us along to resolving some of these issues so that we can strengthen the transmission grid and avoid propagating failures like this in the future.
Professor Morgan, thanks very much indeed. I'm joined now, I hope, by Jared Bernstein, who is a New York City officer from the Department of Emergency Management. Mr. Bernstein, can you hear me all right?
I'm with you, Ted.
Tell me what you know, because what you know is far more important than what we think we know.
What we know is that we have a widespread outage right now. It goes beyond the city of New York, obviously. and the City of New York is implementing its citywide power outage plan, which ensures that we secure life-saving and critical care facilities, as well as environmental impact type things, sewage, making sure that all those facilities are secure, and then working from there on out.
All right, let me get you to talk about, I mean, for example, the subway system.
Yeah.
We know the subways have stopped, so what's going on down there below the ground?
Sure. The MTA, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, and the New York City Fire Department and other appropriate agencies are working together to make sure that any people who may be stranded aboard a subway car are indeed evacuated in a timely fashion, and we're working from there. Our agency is tasked with coordinating the city's overall response.
Again, I'm a little bit concerned because I'm old enough to remember what happened in 1965 when there was a massive power outage, and you had as many as 90,000 people trapped underground. So when you talk about responding as quickly as you can, how many people are available to respond?
Well, the City of New York has 40,000 odd police officers, 10,000 odd firefighters, and the resources of indeed the state and the city are being brought to bear. But residents just need to stay calm, and the City of New York will not forget about them.
Tell me what you know is actually going on in the city. We're looking at a picture, even as your name is up there, and you and I are talking. We're looking at a picture of downtown New York, and it just looks as though the streets are absolutely, that's the Port Authority bus terminal, the streets are absolutely jammed with people. We have this high shot, but what kind of transportation is available? I mean, so many people come from Queens and the Bronx and Brooklyn. How are they getting back home if they don't have their own cars?
Sure. The city is looking at adding extra buses and things of that nature, and possibly opening certain bridges to pedestrian traffic to ensure people get home, and then running extra buses once they're over the bridges. The police department is also deploying extra traffic officers to make sure that we do the best we can in terms of easing those delays.
During and just after the terrible events of 9/11 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, there was quite literally a massive armada of boats that was pulled together, and eventually, it's my understanding, they moved as many as 500,000 people from downtown Manhattan across to New Jersey. Any plan to use boats to get people over to the other side?
Yeah, we are working with the various ferry providers to make sure that extra service is added. Possibly looking at suspending fares on service and things of that nature. Although we don't have anything set right now, but we're working on that as we speak.
All right. Sounds to me as though you need to get back and figure out what you guys are doing before you can tell us what you're going to do. But I thank you very much. Anything the rest of the country needs to know about what's happening in New York right now? Phone system? That
the residents of the City of New York are pulling together as a community, as they always have in times of crisis, and through that we'll get through it together.
No one is ever going to disagree with you when you say nice things about the citizens of New York. But thanks very much. I appreciate it. I hope we can talk to you a little later and get a sense of what's being done.
All right.
As you look at these pictures, they are really self-explanatory. Quite clearly, tremendous traffic problems in the sense of all the traffic lights being out. You're not able to use any trains, any of the subway system. That's the west side of Manhattan that we're looking at right now, and the closest thing that I can analogize it to is when you have the New York City Marathon, and there are tens of thousands of people in the streets, but these are people who presumably need to get home and have no vehicles at the moment to get home. At some point in the next 5 or 10 minutes, I've been told that Mayor Bloomberg is going to hold a press conference, and presumably a lot of the questions that we have been raising will be raised with him and answered by him. I've just gotten a memorandum here that was drafted by my friend Ann Compton, who's been over at the White House, and who says there has been no action to assemble any government response at the White House Situation Room. White House information is that this is a domestic breakdown, rather. That's